Welcome to ASEAN in Focus Weekend Edition. I'm Dr. Kaloy Tabunda from the Development Academy of the Philippines. China, as a political and economic superpower, has a very large effect in the ASEAN region as a whole and its relationship with the various individual ASEAN member nations. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, for instance, one of the most prestigious international financial institutions in the world, has rated China's ranking to #1 economic superpower in the world, surpassing that of the United States of America, based upon the purchasing power parity of GDP indicator. IMF has asserted that China produced 17% of the world's gross domestic product in 2014, exceeding USA's GDP of the world's 16%. China has also played a major role in the territorial dispute in the South China Sea as it continued its aggressive moves in the disputed waters. Today, we are honored to have as guest a leading ASEAN expert. Mr. Chito Romana is a veteran journalist who lived and worked in China for more than 3 decades. He is the former Beijing bureau chief for ABC News, the news division of the American Broadcasting Company. He has covered China as a producer and reporter for ABC News from 1989 until his retirement in 2010, reporting in major stories such as the Tiananmen protests crackdown in 1989 and the Chinese and U.S.-China relations in 1999 and 2001. As a foreign journalist, he witnessed the economic rise of China and its transformation from a third-world country into a major global power. His work as a broadcast journalist covering China has been recognized. He and his news team won an Emmy Award in the News and Documentary category in 2000 and earned 2 other Emmy nominations in 2001 and 2006. His team's coverage of the massive China earthquake in 2008 also won an award from the Overseas Press Club of America. He is also the president of the Philippine Association of Chinese Studies, a network of the country's leading China expert and a professional lecturer in Chinese politics at the Asian Center, University of the Philippines. As a China analyst, he has given briefings on Chinese foreign policy and issues on Philippine-China relations to various government, non-government, and media organizations. Good afternoon, Mr. Romana.
Good afternoon, Dr. Tabunda.
We start our interview taking up from our previous discussion before on the South China Sea issue. We talked before about the Philippines' stand, especially if its case filed with the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. Today, can you comment on the reactions of the 3 other claimant countries? Specifically, we have Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei. We start with Vietnam, sir.
Vietnam's position on the South China Sea is actually very close to the Philippines. It's a frontline state on the South China Sea and also against China, like us. Of course, in our case, we don't have a land border that Vietnam has.
Yes, yes.
What is interesting in the case of Vietnam is that if you look at what happened last year, when the Chinese moved an oil rig to the waters that the Vietnamese considered to be part of their exclusive economic zone, the Vietnamese actually mobilized their navy, their coast guards, their fishing corporations, and they surrounded the oil rig, so much so that there were rammings and exchange of water, water cannons fire. There was even an incident where a Vietnamese ship was rammed and sank.
Yes, yes.
And so they had to rescue the Vietnamese crew. So the Vietnamese, and then within Vietnam, there were anti-Chinese riots.
Yeah, yeah.
Faced with this massive show of resistance, the Chinese actually withdrew their oil rig. So in the case of Vietnam, what we've seen is that they push back in a very vigorous way. In our case, we take a legal challenge more. We don't push back in terms of military or in terms of maritime forces.
Perhaps because our military cannot
match the
Chinese power.
However, what is interesting is that the Vietnamese maintain bilateral talks with China.
In spite of that confrontation.
Despite that. So what they're doing is really a combination. Bilateral approach to China. Part of the reason is because they have party-to-party relations. Vietnam is ruled by a communist party, the same as in China. So they use this for their political advantage to maintain and try to resolve through bilateral negotiation the territorial and maritime issues. On the other hand, they combine this with a multilateral approach through ASEAN, in the case of the Spratlys. So the Vietnamese, divide their issues. Between the Paracels, this is an island of being contested by Vietnam and China alone, and the and the Spratlys, which is being contested by several other parties,
including the Philippines, yeah.
including us. So that's why on the Paracels they use a bilateral approach. In the case of the Spratlys, they use a multilateral approach. So this is one basic difference between us and the Vietnamese. They use they also observe at The Hague during the hearings. They ask for observer status, and they observe what is happening there. So they're also interested in the legal approach, but for now they're keeping it as an option.
And do you think this is more effective than our Philippine approach?
Well, we have to finish the arbitration, but depending on the results of the arbitration, we should learn from the Vietnamese approach. Because the Scarborough Shoal is an issue that only concerns us and China. So there you could use a bilateral approach. On the Spratlys, then we could also use a multilateral approach. So it's not a binary issue, an either or. We made it into an either or issue, bilateral or multilateral, and we chose multilateral alone, and therefore the legal approach. So we don't have a bilateral exchanges or dialogue or negotiations with China right now. I think this is one area where the Vietnamese probably can present us with some lessons.
Yeah, and of course we know that several years ago China and Vietnam actually had a shooting war over one of the territories, right?
Exactly. In the case of the Philippines and China, since even going back to Mischief Reef, and particularly since in 1995 and Scarborough in 2012, no exchange of fire has happened yet. There has been no Filipino casualty.
Yes.
In the case of the Vietnamese, several dozen Vietnamese have already died in this on this issue. First in '74 when the Chinese took over the Paracels by force.
Yes.
And then in 1988 when the Chinese took over Johnson South Reef. These are two reefs and Fiery Cross from the Vietnamese. They didn't take it from the Philippines. They took it from the Vietnamese who were then occupying it. So in the case of the Vietnamese, they also had a border war with China.
Yeah, the land,
in 1979.
land border, yes.
In 1979. So the fighting between the two has been very acute at times. And yet they go back to negotiation. After the border war in 1979, they even cut off diplomatic relations. And for a while the rhetoric was very strong. But then there was a change in Vietnamese leadership, and they decided time to go back to the negotiating table, and they managed to come up with a treaty, one defining the land border, and then a maritime treaty defining the Gulf of Tonkin, and they were able to divide it like 50-50. But it took them more than 10 years of negotiation to come to this. So it is possible to achieve something through negotiation, but you have to be prepared to basically outlast the Chinese.
Okay, how about Malaysia?
Malaysia is another case study. Malaysia's approach is what is called as a quiet diplomacy. They don't engage in maritime confrontation, neither do they have a land border with China, and Malaysia is actually has very strong trade ties with China.
Yes.
So because of their economic benefit, the Malaysians have put a priority on the economic side of their agreement, of their relationship with China. So what they do is they resort to quiet diplomacy. For example, the Chinese claim the southernmost tip of their territory, the southernmost tip of the 9-dash line, is a place called James Shoal, which is just 80-90 miles off Malaysia. But the Malaysians are aware of this. They haven't made a big fuss about it, but they discuss it with the Chinese to clarify the Chinese position. And there is a shoal actually called, I think it's called Luconia, that the Chinese have managed to dredge, and it's now a growing land, and there are two Chinese Coast Guard ships guarding the Malaysians follow a policy of what they call the -1. It's not karaoke.
What's the -1?
The -1 means if they see two Chinese ships on guard there, they send two -1, only one.
Okay.
So they don't want the confrontation. They just want to convey the message to the Chinese that we know what you're doing, but we'd like to know why you're doing it, and they resort to diplomacy. So they try to preserve their economic relationship. They don't want to jeopardize their diplomatic relationship, so they resort to quiet diplomacy.
So everything is quiet, no confrontation.
You don't hear the Malaysians openly criticizing the Chinese.
But of course, they're closely monitoring the Philippine action.
They also applied for observer status,
For
and
the
they were
issues.
there. They had a group, a delegation, observing what happened at the hearings last July.
Okay, Brunei, the most quiet member.
is the most interesting case, because if the Malaysians have quiet diplomacy, the government of Brunei resorts to even quieter,
yeah.
silent diplomacy. They do not wish to participate in meetings of the claimant countries
Yes.
to complain about China. They usually keep quiet, but at the same time, they observe the developments. In the case of Brunei, it's different from the Philippines and Vietnam. They don't occupy any of the reefs and shoals.
Okay.
Their claim is really based on exclusive economic zone. And they follow a cooperative policy with China on economic and oil exploration. So they're talking about jointly exploring some of the areas for oil.
I remember during the GMA administration, there was supposed to be an agreement for joint exploration
Yes.
for oil. What happened there?
This is the joint marine seismic understanding, JSU, I think, or JSMU.
What happened?
Okay, that was for 3 years. In the beginning, the Philippines and China came to an agreement that, let's explore, or not explore, but let's see first. Let's conduct a seismic test if there's anything there. The Vietnamese complained because they also have a claim in that area, so it became a tripartite. But the problem was, during the Arroyo administration, she got involved in domestic politics, in domestic political trouble. And the opposition questioned in the Supreme Court this agreement, basically saying that under the preamble of the Constitution, it says there that all natural resources are the property of the state, and therefore only the state can explore, utilize, and conduct a survey. So because of this, people were saying that the Arroyo could get impeached because of this. So it became a hot political potato. And she decided just to let it expire and did not renew it. The Chinese keep saying, let's go back to that. But the problem now is we have changed basically our approach, because the current administration believes that the area being explored is really Philippine territory, and therefore we cannot allow foreign countries to participate. So this is why the arbitration has to resolve this issue.
Okay. How do you foresee the Philippines' stand will be with the change of administration in 2016?
It is actually an interesting question and a very delicate one, because it goes into predicting the future. But I think if I were to look at the situation now, I think whichever candidate wins will probably see the arbitration case, will push for it to finish. I mean, some people say it could end by the end of Aquino's term, but it may extend for another 6 months or so, the arbitration case, depending on whether we win over the jurisdiction issue. So it depends a lot on the results of the arbitration case, because this will determine, the legal basis of our position and the justification, the validation of our position. Among the candidates, I think you could expect probably Mar Rojas to continue the current direction. And then you have Binay expressing that he's for bilateral
yes.
approach, and he wants joint cooperation. And then you have Grace Poe. She had a statement in her in a key speech saying that the West Philippine Sea is ours, but we should pursue it in a legal and diplomatic, peaceful and legal and diplomatic manner, and strengthen the Navy and the Coast Guard. So what I foresee is that there will be, of course, a major policy review, how to proceed. I think we have to, the candidates though, I think will have to face the reality that the Philippine-China relation is now at their lowest stage of development since diplomatic relations were established in 1975, and the relations now are at a very abnormal state, because basically there are hardly any but high-level dialogue happening or contacts happening. The Chinese president and the Chinese foreign minister has managed to avoid the Philippines since they came to power in 2012, 2013. And hopefully we'll see both of them at APEC, but it's still a case of wait and see. So I think whoever will become president will probably try to at least either gradually, or the question would be the rate of speed to restore or to normalize the relations.
Okay, what is the advantage of normalizing the relations? Especially now that China is reestablishing the Silk Road, they call it the Maritime Silk Road.
The Chinese actually are interested to have more contacts. You know, what's happening right now is that the dispute, the island dispute, the Spratlys, the Scarborough dispute, is at the front and center of the relationship, and because of this, it affects the relationship. So the issue is how to manage the dispute. And so you can have other spheres of the relations going forward: trade, culture, sports, political. So the advantage basically is, given the Chinese offers right now in their Silk Road initiative, you could benefit from economic cooperation with China. This is being undermined now because of the artificial islands issue, island building.
They've just
the
inaugurated the lighthouses.
The lighthouses to strengthen their claim. So the issue here really is whether it's possible to, from a high level of statesmanship and pragmatism, to be able to maintain relations while managing the dispute. The disputes won't go away right away. Even after arbitration, it will only clarify the maritime aspect. The territorial aspect is not covered by UNCLOS, and therefore it will continue for a while. And then you add the geopolitical aspect of the rivalry between China and the US, so it's not going to disappear right away. The key is, in a sense, just like the US, our treaty ally, they have differences with China, and yet they talk. This is one thing we have not done. We have resorted to arbitration, and then we stop talking. It's not only our problem. The Chinese also did not want to talk. But the problem now is that there are indications that they're of a desire, at least, to renew. And I think this is the challenge that will face the new president.
You're still a frequent visitor to China even after your stint with ABC. What is the feel of the Chinese citizens on this issue?
You see, what are the group I have, the Philippine Association of Chinese Studies, as well as the UP. UP set up a special China Strategic Studies group. The basic goal is to stay engaged, to maintain the channels of communication so that we know what they're thinking. Okay, I'll give you two examples. In 2013, when we went to China, you know, with a group of scholars from UP as well as from my association, the basic message of the Chinese then is that, why did you file a case against us? You should drop this. And we tried to explain it, and they said they couldn't believe it. It's almost like, how dare you, a small country, doing for the first time China. Somebody filed a case against China, and the message was this. It's almost the very confusion. One Chinese scholar said, under Confucian culture, to file a case against a neighbor is to insult and humiliate the neighbor. So you could see the cultural gap was so big. But we went recently, just the past 2 months, And the message this time was they no longer were, they knew we wouldn't withdraw the arbitration. This time they said, what do you want? What does the Philippines want? We don't understand you. You don't act like another Asian country. And we tried to explain, yes, you have to understand the mindset of the Filipinos. Because the problem with China, I think, is that they view the Philippines as an extension of the U.S. pivot strategy. So we try to explain to them that beyond that, the Philippines, is interested basically in defending the exclusive economic zone. And this is what drives the Philippine position.
This time, we will talk about your experience as a journalist covering China. How do you describe your experience? How many years were you there?
I lived and worked in China for 37 years, but I spent some years as a student studying the Chinese language.
Yeah. So you're fluent in
Mandarin. Yeah.
Mandarin. Okay.
Mandarin. And there was a time in China they became so nationalistic that in the press conferences of the foreign ministry they said no more questions in English, only in Chinese. They said when we're at the State Department in the US, they make us speak in English. There's no translation. So here in China, you have to speak in Chinese, no translation. So those who knew the language had an advantage. Otherwise, you have to bring your translator or interpreter. But that changed quickly as China, became more open, and so now you can function in English. But to describe the life of a foreign journalist in China, it's different, totally different from the life as a journalist here. You see, here everybody likes to talk, so you can interview a lot of people. In China, the officials don't want to be interviewed, so it's very difficult to do it. Or if they, even before the spokesman of the government, everything was scripted. And whatever question you ask, the same answer is given back to you. Now it has changed.
So how do you take? How did you take it? You were given the same answer.
No, because you try several times and it's not going to move, so it ends pretty fast. So we had to develop contacts, of course, not only with the government, but with the ordinary people, and we tried our best. But there's an additional problem in China. They used to equate foreign journalists. You're in journalism, you want information, you want details and so on what's going on. And they equate that with the work of foreign spies. So sometimes they would tell you, there's the surveillance issue is a real problem here. And we would notice it because when we would go, we stayed in a diplomatic compound. We were under the foreign ministry,
and you were
the
continually
information
being
department, and we had to rent these offices and apartments from the foreign ministry. And so you go out it's a guarded compound, and then you go out. Then somehow you notice motorcycle, plainclothes, trailing you, and security. This was particularly after Tiananmen, the Tiananmen protests, and the crackdown on Tiananmen.
What about now?
Now it fluctuates. The most open period was before and during the Olympics. Because they wanted to show the world.
2008.
2008. Yeah, I covered the Olympics there, and it was a great experience. It was just like covering any other country. But right after the Olympics, then they go back again. And now it remains tight because the Chinese, they're very clear. The new president Xi Jinping has made it very clear. He is not for liberal democracy. He is no Gorbachev that's going to reform the Chinese system into a no glasnost for sure. Instead, what they have is that they want to avoid what happened during Gorbachev's time, meaning the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they want to strengthen the Communist Party rule. And because of that, there's a crackdown on dissidents, on writers, on aspects of religion, particularly those that tend to question the authority of the Chinese government. So it's not an easy time to be a journalist. But if somebody wants to advance his career in journalism, you have to cover China. And that's why there's a big competition for covering China.
And you have an Emmy Award for that. Congratulations.
Well, thanks a lot. But it's really a team effort.
Yes. Yes.
We work together because I work with my a crew. You know, we work as a team, and it's really because of the interest in China. You see, the Emmy that we got was during the Millennium celebration in China, and this was because it was part of a 24-hour coverage led by the anchor Peter Jennings, and we focused on Shanghai. We did some live shots of Shanghai, coupled with features on why Shanghai is the premier city, and how the Chinese look at this phenomenon, how fireworks originated in China. So it was a feature that was part of a global coverage that won this award. And then the two other nominations, one had to do with an AIDS village.
AIDS village.
This is at the time when the Chinese denied that there was AIDS, HIV/AIDS in China. And we found this village where there were the AIDS patients. And in their case, the AIDS was because of blood transfusion. The peasants sold their blood in order to survive. And because of the transfusion and the use of the needles, that's how AIDS spread.
When was this?
Oh, that was 2004.
Okay, more than 10 years ago.
Yeah, even earlier, 2003, because that was the time when China was still in denial. But that changed, and so then they faced reality and they tried to solve this problem. But the other nomination had to do with documenting China's economic rise. You know, to show the attitudes and to do a lot of features on that, and that was the time when the international audience, particularly the American audience, was focused on China, and we hit it at the right time. So a lot of it is a combination of work as well as research,
good
and
timing.
there's an element of luck.
Yeah, good timing. Okay, quickly, can you give us a highlight of your career in China?
Well, I think,
apart from the Emmy Awards,
among the biggest story was really the crackdown on Tiananmen. Basically the Tiananmen demonstration.
That was in
1989. I was able, you see, of course, when I was a student activist in the Philippines, I used to march. So when my bosses in New York were saying, you used to march, why don't you cover the demonstrations and follow the students? So from the start of the student protest, we covered it almost on a daily basis. Over a period of almost 3 months.
3 months,
after the big demonstrations in Tiananmen Square, leading up to the crackdown. And this was this was really a big event in China. And on the one hand, it led to a tragedy, a crackdown, because the Communist Party felt threatened. They felt they were about to be overthrown, and they cracked down, and it caused a lot of damage on China's international reputation. But it also brought about one of the biggest turnaround in Chinese history, when Deng Xiaoping decided to push through with economic reform, and it
that started
led
the rise
to
of
more.
China.
But the second biggest one, the one experience that I hard to forget is the crisis in U.S.-China relations. After this, and it is very similar to what's happening now. There was an American plane that was flying over Hainan, and the Chinese plane challenged it, and in the course of challenging it, they actually hit each other. The Chinese plane fell into the ocean, and the American plane was forced to land in Hainan without the permission of the Chinese.
When was this?
This was already 2001.
Okay.
And it brought a major crisis in U.S.-China relations, and there were demonstrations in front of the U.S. embassy, and even the U.S. ambassador got trapped in the embassy. He couldn't leave because the Chinese were surrounding it. So it was quite a remarkable time in China.
Interesting times. How do you describe Philippine media's coverage of ASEAN integration? Do you think they're doing enough? At least the mainstream media.
Well, it's tough because you have to, what is ASEAN integration? What does it mean to have one market, one ASEAN? It involves economic issues, tariff barriers.
So it's hard to translate down to the level of the masses.
But I think it's how to relate it to the daily lives of people, whether they'll be able to benefit from cheaper goods. There'll also be competition, though, for jobs. There'll be competitions in certain sectors. So there are plus and minuses. The key, though, is how to prepare and the people so that they're ready for it. And the media, I think, of course, has to do a bigger job. But
Yeah,
you know,
in
between
terms
the
of raising
day-to-day
awareness,
politics and the day-to-day stories,
Mm-mm.
this is more you're describing like a process over
Yeah.
time. And because of that, it loses in the daily grind of journalism. You know, it doesn't sell as much, but it remains to be a challenge, and it's a reality that we will face. And so I think it's a continuing challenge that we will have to do.
So do you think media is not doing enough to raise the level of awareness of the common people?
Well, I think the problem is they have to assign beat reporters. They have to assign people who will stick to the issue. If they flit in and out, you're never going to be able to do a good job. And this is the problem, because does it belong to the business beat, or does it belong to the international affairs? We don't usually have a separate beat. We just use the wire services. So in this case, it's actually deploying resources and understanding the story. And so here, I think you need to engage the gatekeepers, the editorial desk, how they will do it, the importance of this story. So that's the first challenge. And then later is to explain what it means to the ordinary people. And it's already by the end of the year.
End of the year, 2015. It's
a start.
3 months from now, 2 months from now.
Exactly.
And
the consciousness is not quite there.
Compared to, I think, some of our neighbors already.
This is the challenge, though, between domestic news and regional or world news. Usually, the principal focus is on domestic news. So how to relate it to the domestic scene. And I think that is the challenge, because then people will see it. If it has an impact, whether for the good, for the better, or for worse, they have to be able to feel it and to see it. And only then will they appreciate.
Concretely, what is your suggestion on how to raise awareness?
Well,
Who should be
I think
targeted
the scholars
first?
should be able to explain it to the editors. That's the key first. And then the editors will then have to go down to assign beat reporters or assign series reporters to be able to flesh this out. And then at the same time, you need a combination of work between government and the private sector, so that it then will become a major talking point. And in the beginning, it's just like, it's very similar, like APEC. It happens every year. But unless it happens, people don't focus on it, because it deals with economic issues. The same with Trade Pacific Partnership, TPP, what does it mean? Or RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. All of this are like alphabet soup of all this. But how to relate it, the key really is how to relate it to the daily lives of people. In what types of goods will become cheaper? What types of services? I think, for example, if people know, particularly the young students and the professionals, that some of their degrees and some of their qualifications will be recognized in the whole region, and therefore you could find jobs elsewhere, but it also means those elsewhere can find jobs here. So the competition will intensify. But the need for developing competitive skills, it's actually related to the K-12 educational reform, because only then will become competitive. So if you approach it from the area of competitiveness, I think then you may have more traction in terms of publicity, in terms of how to survive in today's world. And since we're a country that thrives on OFWs and overseas workers, I think this is something, if they see that it would increase opportunities to work in Malaysia or Singapore or even Bangkok, then they may find more relevance. And if they see that there will be certain goods that will become even cheaper, then I think the benefits will become clearer. So it's relating it to the day-to-day needs of
Yeah.
the people.
You mentioned the role of the academy, of course, the scholars. What about government? What should be its role here?
Well, government has to, of course, they were involved in the negotiation and they have a better grasp of the issues. So they should be able to at least lead in
Yes.
terms of explaining it to the public.
Do you think
And
it's
then-
doing enough? It is doing enough now.
Well, it's never enough.
It's never enough.
So
yeah.
it's got to be a continuing challenge because of the limited time. But I think the drumbeat is there,
Yes,
and we
yes.
just have to continue pounding on it until it becomes like a daily mantra for people, and they begin to appreciate and they begin to question what does it really mean, especially as the deadline
Yeah, yeah.
approaches and as it affects them.
Yeah, because whether we like it or not, the whole country will be affected by ASEAN integration. This is actually a major milestone in our history as a nation, in our relationship with our neighbors.
With our neighbors,
Yeah.
yes. And the whole idea of one ASEAN, one market, you know, for goods and services, and then ASEAN is also has a free trade agreement
Yes.
with China, with other countries, and then all of this will become bigger with this regional comprehensive economic partnership, and then the TPP. I mean, basically it's like broadening our consciousness and broadening our, in a sense, our economy. So it is in that context, I think, as that of our Filipino can survive in a globalized world.
Okay.
In that context.
Final word. What do you think is ASEAN integration for the common Filipino?
Well, I think for the common Filipino, when they hear ASEAN and integration, it probably just goes over their heads because you have to
Sadly.
explain first why would they care about ASEAN,
So
and
we really
second,
have
why
to
would they
do-
care about integration. But I think now, for so long, we've been concerned more with, because of our history with Spain or with the US, with Europe. Now we go closer
Yes.
to where we're actually
Our neighborhood.
our own neighborhood, and now we're actually getting intertwined in terms of markets for goods and services, and it will have an impact on our
Yes.
purchasing power, our consumption of goods, and in terms of our welfare,
Yes.
our day-to-day lives. So I think as we come to appreciate this, then ASEAN integration will become not only a catchword, what will have a direct impact on their livelihood.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Santo Romana.
Thanks a lot.
I wish we
Okay.
could have more conversations
Okay.
in the future.
Thank you very much, Steve.
That's all, folks. Thank you very much.